The Snake, posted by Sean Arthur Cox. I was 5 years old when I first vomited up the snake. A second grader cornered me on the playground and shoved me off the swing because he wanted to turn. My palms skinned, knees dirty, I climbed to my feet, tears in my eyes and fists clenched in sorrow and rage, and there he sat on my swing, laughing. That's when I felt it. A tightness in my throat, a lump that threatened to choke me, a writhing in my belly. I heaved, and instead of lunch coming up, a small little snake came out. I was dumbstruck, terrified. Fear quickly replaced my anger. How had a snake gotten in my stomach? Were there others? The bully stared, equally shocked, and while I still carried a little resentment for him, I had more important concerns. The snake eyed the kid on the swing, gave a hiss, and then slithered back to me. It wrapped itself around my ankles before I regained enough composure to move. I tried shaking it off and running away, but the snake held me too tightly, slowly working its way up my leg. I clawed at it, but no luck. It kept climbing me higher and higher on my small body. I opened my mouth to scream, but when I did, it darted for my face and slid down my throat, just as forcefully as it had come up. The teacher didn't believe us. She told us that I must have seen a worm and eaten it, and that I shouldn't eat worms. That was the first time, but not the last. In 7th grade, my friend Carter and I were walking home from school. It had just rained, and there were mud puddles everywhere. He thought it would be hilarious to splash me, and I ended up soaked and caked in mud. I was a little annoyed, but tried to take it in stride. I splashed him back, and he lost his mind and started yelling at me. "What the hell?" he shouted. "Do you know how much this shirt costs? Why would you do that, Dick?" "You splashed me first," I said, utterly indignant. "Yeah, but your shirt's like from Kmart. No one cares if it gets messed up." He never brought up the fact that my family was poor before, but saying it then that my clothes didn't matter, that I didn't matter because I was poor, set me off. As he stormed away from me, muttering every curse word a 7th grader knows, I stood there wet and shivering from cold and from my growing anger. My cheeks burned hot with hatred, and I could feel it rising, large and venomous. I collapsed to my knees as the snake came up again. I had almost forgotten it had ever happened at all, and when I was reminded of it, I always assumed I had misremembered or made up the whole thing, but there it was, my snake. It was larger than when I was 5 and more aggressive. It went straight for Carter, and I was too surprised to say anything until it was too late. Striking impossibly fast, it bit him in the ankle. I gasped in horror as he cried out in pain, and the snake slithered back to me. I tried to get away from it, just as I had when I was 5. I ran to my friend to take back what had happened, to suck out the poison or something. As I knelt down, however, the snake came for me. Carter tried to warn me, his anger replaced by shock of getting bit. He must have thought it had been hiding in the mud puddle. It didn't help the snake came for me, wrapped itself around my throat and forced itself into my mouth again. I didn't know what to do, so I tried to ignore it, to get the poison out of him, but he shoved me back. "Stay away from me, freak!" he shouted as he limped away. I sat there alone and crying, drenched in mud and shame. We never spoke again. In high school, it was a struggle to keep the snake down. I have always been short and unathletic. I struck out twice in t-ball, I was bookish, I was into theater and science. Needless to say, I got picked on a lot. My throat was in constant pain for years forcing the thing down, but I could always feel it down in my guts, growing larger day by day. While walking home from school one day, a guy from chemistry class drove by. He'd been giving me grief for ages. Since freshman year, my throat had begun to reflexively clench when I saw him in the hallways or at football games. On this day, he swung his door open as he passed, clipping me and knocking me to the pavement. I could feel the bruises starting before I even hit the ground, but more than that, I felt a swelling in my throat. A pain so intense I nearly blacked out, and from my mouth slithered a disturbingly large snake. at least 10 feet long and 6 inches thick. There was no way. It was physically impossible. How much had it grown since last I slipped and let it out? How could something so great and terrible possibly fit inside of me? I couldn't breathe. My eyes were too filled with tears to see clearly, but I knew what was happening. The snake raced down the road after the car. I lost sight of it, but soon after heard a loud bang like a gunshot or the screams of a tire, the crunch of metal, and then the sound of glass shattering filled the air. And then the snake returned, a little larger than before, but still a terrifying creature. I clenched my jaws shut, but the thing wrapped itself around my head, covering my nose so I couldn't breathe without opening my mouth. When I could hold out no more, I gasped for air, and it went in. Once more, I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. I could only cry in silent agony as the snake forced its way back in. A pain as though my jaw were breaking as it forced its way back in. Back to coil up in my belly and sleep, to grow and prepare to strike again. The news would later report that the car had blown a tire, causing the driver to lose control of the vehicle and impact into a tree, ejecting the driver. He would spend the next 4 weeks in the hospital recovering. He would go through physical therapy. He might never play sports again, his promising career crushed before it started. What a tragedy. But I knew what really happened. The snake, my snake, had escaped, had tracked him down, and had bitten his tire as he raced away. Some part of me felt guilty for what happened. When I would see him limp down the hallways, when I would hear his voice fade away when the rest of the team would talk about state championships. But then I would see the way he stared at me, read the things he wrote in my yearbook, and in my stomach, I could feel the snake sleeping soundly and contently. I've never had many friends. I was too afraid they would find out about the snake and call me a freak like Carter had. But not Julian. Julian was into the same things I was. He was cool, at least as far as my definition of cool went. He really listened when we'd talk. He understood me. I'd never been closer to another human being as I had been with Julian. One night, we were drinking some bourbon we'd snuck out of his dad's liquor cabinet, and I told him about the snake. At first, he thought I was speaking metaphorically. No, I told him. It was literally a snake. He laughed, then got serious. He probably thought I was crazy, but he never said it, never implied it, and that meant the world to me. I love that guy. Years later in college, we went out to a bar after catching a friend's improv show, and some homophobic dick came to our table, started calling Julian all sorts of terrible names. I told him to back off, but he didn't. Finally, the bartender got involved and made the guy leave. We nursed our drinks, but the verbal assault put a damper on the evening, and sooner rather than later, we called it a night. When we finally left, the guy was waiting for us in the parking lot. He came at us hard, swearing and swinging. I've already said I'm small, and this guy had at least a head on me. He could take me in a fair fight, an unfair fight, any sort of way he wanted. It didn't matter. I tried to step in anyway, to stop him from attacking Julian, but he shoved me aside as easily as anything. I lay powerless on the ground as he shoved Julian down to the ground and began to kick him mercilessly. I shook, and this time I felt my throat begin to swell. I took a deep breath and let it happen. The thing about the snake is it wants to be out. It wants to be anywhere but inside me, except it needs to rest and recover. The thing slid effortlessly from my mouth, the size of an anaconda, bigger than me easily, and somehow that thing fit inside my tiny little body, coiled up in my guts, always waiting to seize the moment and escape. Facing no resistance, it didn't hurt me at all. It flew from me, wrapped around the drunk bastard, and began squeezing the life out of him. He never even saw it coming. Who would? Who would expect an anaconda to fly out from a guy's mouth and crush you? No one. Definitely not that drunk guy. I heard his bones break, but he didn't scream. Oh, he tried. I watched his face contort in agony, but the snake was so tight around him, he didn't have the air to make a peep. I watched it happen. I didn't even try to wrestle it back in. I just watched. Julian watched too. He watched in horror, in awe. 1,000 emotions flashed across his face, and I looked for one that let me know if we'd still be close when this was all over. Something to let me know if he'd be my friend at all. The snake unhinged its jaws and began to swallow the drunk. My stomach turned in horror and righteous anger, and when it was over, it slithered back to me, wound its way up my legs and arms, and then disappeared back into my mouth as easily as it had come. It didn't hurt a bit. Instead, it coiled comfortably in my stomach like a hot meal on a cold day. It felt better, justified, whole. Then I saw Julian, his face mixed of fear, confusion, and revolution. "You really have a snake in you," was all he could stammer out. I tried to take his shoulder to explain, but he just turned and walked away. My heart broke, and the snake stirred in its slumber. For 3 days, he didn't return my texts, and finally, I stopped trying. Then a week later, he called me. "As far as I'm concerned," he said, "we are still good. You never lied. You told me a long time ago about the snake. I didn't believe you, but that doesn't mean you didn't tell me. And you saved me. No one ever stood up for me like that, not even my family, and I've never thanked you for that, so thank you for that." We agreed to meet for drinks to talk about what happened. We went to a place called Mickey Finn's, and we let the questions flood out. What happened? How long had I been dealing with it? Did the cops suspect anything? How guilty should we feel? Really, given what the guy wanted to do? Julian convinced me we shouldn't feel guilty at all. I felt a little funny about it. It was easy for him to say not to feel bad. It wasn't his snake. But he was right about a couple things at least. The guy was a bastard. The guy was probably going to kill Julian. He had it coming. Didn't he? As we made our way back to the car, a couple of assholes stepped up and gave Julian and me a shove and an insult. "You don't want to fight this tonight," Julian said. And I got a distinct impression he had his run-ins with a few of these guys before. "Or what?" said one. "Your boyfriend's gonna kick our asses." "I'm not his boyfriend," I said, "but you don't want to do it. I know I don't." They laughed to each other, and mid-laugh, one swung hard, punching Julian in the face, sending him sprawling. The other, taking me by surprise, got me in a chokehold. With my friend out of the fight, the first came and started dropping blow after blow into my abdomen. I could feel the snake stirring deep within me, but I didn't know if I would be able to let it out or if even I wanted to. The second man's arms constricted around my throat as surely as the snake had the other man's a week ago. I couldn't let any air out, let alone a snake. Would it be able to come up? Would I want it to, knowing what it's capable of? My vision started to blur around the edges. The world slowly turned black, and I could see the first had pulled away and begun giving Julian another barrage of punches. Before losing consciousness, I felt my mouth drop open and the lurch of the snake biting at the arm around my neck. Then I collapsed to the ground, pulled down by the loss of oxygen and my attacker's own fall. I woke and found Julian beaten and bloody, but raining kicks down on the attackers. My snake lay curled on me, waiting for me. It lazily slunk toward me and then disappeared down my throat. I didn't want the thing inside me, but given it had just saved my life twice in 2 weeks, I didn't fight it much. I only resisted a little, so it only hurt a little. "It didn't swallow them," I said, looking at the other. "What happened?" Julian stopped kicking. "It bit him." He showed me the puncture wounds as I slowly got to my feet. There was a molting of the skin where the necrosis had begun to set in. They may have been comatose, they may have been dead. I didn't want to check, but the way the snake snuggled up in my belly told me anyway. They had felt the sting of my anger, their veins burned with the heat of my hatred. They wouldn't bother anyone else again. "Let's get out of here," I said, my stomach in knots. A few blocks later, Julian broke the silence. "Maybe the snake isn't a curse," he said. "It's evil," I said. "Maybe. Maybe it's just a tool," he said. "A tool's not good or evil. It's all in how you use it." "And how should I use it?" I said, feeling disgusted with what he'd just said, but more disgusted by how comfortable I was with the idea. Think of all the assholes, the bigots out there curb-stomping people just because they look different, pray different, love different. The last words hung extra hard in the air, pointed, accusatory. I had a lot to think about. The news reported 2 men killed by snakebite. Through talk screens, they couldn't say what kind, neither could the snake experts. No snakes missing from the zoo. No one knew where the snakes had come from or where it had gone. No one but me and Julian. Julian and I went out again, this time to a dive bar in a part of town that hid hostility behind words like conservative and traditional family values. We hung out in the parking lot, pretending to flirt until someone came up to us to give us grief about it. When he spit the first homophobic slur at us, I leaned in, opened my mouth, and before I even knew what happened, the snake had already struck, biting him on the neck before disappearing back down my throat and into my awaiting belly. It was over in an instant. I didn't fight it anymore. The snake wants to be out. It wants to grow and feed and strike. And it became so easy to let it out. I almost wondered why I had held it back in the first place. It was so easy to point it at others, at the monsters, the assholes, the people who wronged me. Too easy. A few months later, the snake still dominated the news. It had killed 9 people. Still no one knew where it had come from. Experts couldn't agree on what kind it was. Julian and I went out for drinks a lot. One night, after a long search for some asshole deserving my special friend, we gave up and made our way back to Julian's. We'd both had a bit to drink and stumbled to the couch. Julian looked at me deeply and said, "I never thanked you." "You did," I said. "Not properly," he said. "And not just for saving me. Not just for what we've been doing, but for everything." "Yeah, man. No problem." "Really," he said. "I appreciate it, and I want you to know how much I appreciate it." He leaned in and kissed me. Maybe it was the booze. Maybe it was the residual buzz from getting away with something, from sharing a secret that big. Maybe it was something deeper. Whatever it was, for a while, I let him. And then I stopped him. Some old, long-forgotten circuit from my conservative upbringing kicked in, and I pushed him off. "I'm not gay," I said. "Of course you're not," he said, and winked and moved him back towards me. "Seriously," I said. I gave him a second rebuff. "I'm not gay." He gave me a look like I'd told him the moon didn't really exist. "Okay, so you're bi or pan, but you can't pretend you're not in love with me." "I'm not," I said, my voice rising. "I'm straight, Julian." He gave me an incredulous look, a wounded look, and I hated him. I hated him for calling me gay. I hated him for that hurt expression like it was my fault we would never get together, for touching some raw nerve I didn't know I had. "We're not getting together," I shouted, fury seizing every muscle in my body. "It's never happening." Before I could stop it, before I could clench my throat, the snake was out and had wrapped itself around him. I tried to pry it off, tried to get it to come back inside, but it turned at me, hissed at me, like it knew a secret that it wasn't ready to tell. Then it turned back to Julian, his eyes filled with tears, his skin turning purple. I beat the snake, put my mouth on it to try to swallow it back down, but I had lost control of it. I had forgotten how. And all the while, I hated him. I hated him for pushing the issue. I hated him for making it so easy to let the snake out. I hated him for kissing me. I hated him for being right about me, even if I wasn't ready to admit it yet, but I couldn't stop it. I sat there, weak and impotent, and I watched it happen. The hate grew, the snake grew, until it swallowed him whole. It turned back to me, tears streaming down my face, my voice too hoarse to scream, my fists white, my palms bloody from how hard my fingernails had pressed into them. It tried to make its way back to my mouth, but I wouldn't let it anymore. The snake pressed harder, tried to force its way in, but I was done. I had convinced myself keeping it locked up inside was the problem, letting it have a place to hide. I hated it. I hated Julian, and I hated those assholes who taught me how to let it out so easily. I hated Carter and the guy from chemistry. I hated the kid from 2nd grade, and as far as I knew, there was no snake before him. It was all his fault. I hated everyone, and I didn't want it anymore. So it left me. But the snake attacks continued, and I knew what it was doing. Lurking in the darkness, slipping through the shadows, feeding on my anger, killing people who made me mad. These days, I read the news a lot. I look for pundits, politicians, columnists, and crime reports. I look for people to hate. And it's so easy to find people to hate these days. I read the news and surf the internet looking for things for my snake to eat. Anything to keep it busy. Anything to keep it from tracking down the person I really, truly despise. Sometimes, I worry I don't keep it busy enough, because sometimes I lay in bed at night and I am certain I hear hissing outside my window.